27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, a 94 rating. Certainly not what it was last year in Philly, or 2 years ago in Philly. But it just didn't work, and there's always a chance there's a change of mind inside the building. But everything I've heard and been able to reaffirm, they're moving on after 1 year of Carson Wentz.
Got your Mac and Mac guys, John McMullen and Jody McDonald here. We on Birds 365. We had a third face to the mix. He's a very familiar face in Indianapolis. Been covering the Colts since they got there, and he does it these days for Fox 59 in Indy. Mike Chappell joins us here on Birds 365. How's the offseason treating you, Mike?
So far, it's not been much of an offseason, and it probably will pick up in the next few weeks.
Yeah, March 18th, Mike. I think that is the day where Carson Wentz has that roster bonus due. So is that the thought in Indianapolis, that the Colts want to get something done before the second day of the new league year, or is it? Do you think it's going to drag on a little bit longer than that?
No, it won't drag on longer than that because of the finances. The trigger date is March 16th, really. That's the start of the new league year. Let's say that we hit DEFCON 1 and they just cut him. Well, they can't, because everything accelerates and they haven't got the cap space to assume the guaranteed portion of the contract. So they have to wait to do something March 16th. It's got to be done before the third league, or the third day of the new league year, because of those bonuses. So we're sort of in a holding pattern. It's awkward because you're looking at, if you just drop somebody from Mars who had casual interest or knowledge of the NFL, you'd say this quarterback had a pretty good season. 27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, a 94 rating. Certainly not what it was last year in Philly, or 2 years ago in Philly. But it just didn't work, and there's always a chance there's a change of mind inside the building. But everything I've heard and been able to reaffirm, they're moving on after 1 year of Carson Wentz.
Mike, you did a nice job of laying it out there, but I need you to expand. You say it just didn't work, which both John and I might agree with you on that, but we need more details. Why didn't it work? Because you're right, the stats look okay on paper, but you're a guy who watched every snap that Carson Wentz took this year. And yes, the Eagles are very thankful he took that many snaps, because it means they got a first-round draft pick out of it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Why didn't it work?
I think there's a lot of things, and most will never come out probably. There was a lack of leadership. There was. On the field, there just were too many instances where a play needed to be made and it wasn't. It wasn't all Carson Wentz. The last 2 games, he was awful. This team was awful. It just was. This defense blew a lot of leads, but it comes down to the quarterback, and he just didn't make the plays. One of the quotes that Chris Ballard gave us at the end of the season was, "Make the layups." You know, it's great to make the throw he did at Arizona, back of the end zone, or he had a couple of great throws against Tampa Bay, but make the plays when it's 3rd and 7, keep the ball, keep the chains moving, and he just didn't do it. And internally, there was a decision. There has been a decision, I believe, to move on. And I don't know that we'll ever get all the reasons. I just don't think a team normally airs its laundry like that, which leaves the speculation, which sometimes is counterproductive because it leads to speculation and the old unnamed sources. But I just believe that, starting with high management, which is the owner, they've decided to not compound what ended up being one mistake, which was the trade. It was made, and a lot of us endorsed it because it gave him a chance to get stability at quarterback, but it didn't work out. And instead of trying to roll it back and say, well, maybe if we have a full off season, if we have a training camp, if he doesn't have ankle surgery, and if there's not COVID, then it'll get better. And they're just not willing to take that risk.
Well, you mentioned Jim Irsay a little bit there, Mike, and he was at least certainly intimated about some of the leadership issues that at least he perceived. And one of them is, and I don't want to get in a political discussion, but was the vaccine and the fact that Carson was not vaccinated. There were a number of quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins in Minnesota, Lamar Jackson, but Carson was in that group. And then you start to debate from a football perspective. Well, this guy's supposed to be the leader of the team. That's the leadership aspect that we're talking about. How much did his unwillingness to go in that direction, how much do you think that affected Irsay's thinking?
Fair question, and we don't know. Some, it has to, some, because we go back to, I think it was in training camp or pre-training camp or maybe even off-season where Jim Irsay made it very clear where he came down on the side of vaccinations. He urged, and both, he and Chris Ballard and Frank Reich, they urged their players as much as they could. I mean, this is something that with the union, you can't mandate, you can't mandate vaccination. But the fact remains, a lot of their leaders and higher profile players were not vaccinated. The Quentin Nelsons and on down, Eric Fisher, Darius Leonard. So I think that really irritated the owner. And so that was another brick on the pile with Carson Wentz, I believe. And then you were just rolling the dice as the season went on. And it didn't bit him in the rear end at the end of the season. Remember, he tested positive. What was it, prior to the Raider game?
And he didn't practice that week, right?
Right, so, but the only reason he played was because they had that revised quarantine. So
changed the rules in midstream.
Right. Yeah. And I'm convinced that and the team really hasn't addressed it, and teams won't address it, but they had a lot of major players come down with COVID at the end of the season, missed time, and the team was just flat, worn down, whatever term you want to use. And I'm just not convinced that wasn't a factor. That all these guys are going to get the same time, and then it takes you a little bit of time to get back. So, and I don't want to give these guys an out because they had a 98% chance of making the playoffs. 98%.
Yeah.
With 2 weeks to go. So, but I think that's a fair question, and I believe that did have some influence in Irsay's angst with his quarterback.
Mike, I'm going to follow up with an Irsay question, and including the whole vaccination thing into it, and that's on Carson Wentz. The organization made the decision to trade for Carson Wentz, give up a conditional 2, which became a 1 and a 3, and turn the team over to him, and got the 98% chance to make the playoffs with 2 weeks ago, and it didn't happen. So the results are in. Who's getting more blame in the eye of the ownership? The general manager who pulled the deal, trigger on the deal, or the coach who you would think should know him quite well since he came from Philadelphia and worked with him, if it is now considered a failure, which if you're guaranteeing he's done one way or the other, it is, who's going to take more blame for it in the owner's eyes?
Well, that's another good question. I suppose if you're saying, you're portioning out blame, I would assume Frank Reich, because he is the one that endorsed it. And again, he endorsed Phillip Rivers the year before and was right. In this case, it hasn't worked out. It didn't work out. So if you're saying, who's more to blame, because I do believe that Frank Reich did not have to sell Ballard or Irsay on Phillip Rivers very hard. I think there was a consensus that, this will work. It's short term, but it'll work. I think with this one, the owner was hesitant, and maybe Chris Ballard was a little. I don't know. Again, I don't think we'll ever get the full story on that. But I do think there was more lobbying that had to be done, and that's where you trust. That's where you trust your head coach / former long-time quarterback that he's making the right decision. So they're in it together, primarily Ballard and Reich. But I do think Frank had a heavier hand in this. And, if we're going to give him credit for making Jacoby Brissett a viable quarterback and Phillip Rivers a playoff quarterback, then he has to take a portion of the blame for this not working.
Yeah, that was where I was going to go next too, as well, Mike, was Frank, and I have tremendous respect for Frank Reich, and I know he was well respected, certainly, and is well respected in Indianapolis. But we know this industry and how quickly things change. And you mentioned Frank was obviously at the forefront of lobbying for Carson. It hasn't worked out. Does that start the clock on Frank Reich? Everybody's got a shelf life in this league. If the Colts underachieve next year, are we talking about Frank Reich on the hot seat? Does this change how he's thought of in that organization, in that city?
Well, you will have to wonder what the patient level of the owner is, and not just Frank, but Chris Ballard as well. I mean, I don't say they're tied at the hip, but they were both giving extensions last training camp through, I think, 2026. And so that's why I said they're really going down a complicated road to where you're going to reload probably. One thing, I didn't guarantee they're going to make the move, but if I were betting my next 3 mortgages, I would say that's what they're going to do. But I do think it's complicated because now you're going to reload probably. This will be Frank's 5th, I think it is, or 5th straight year with the starting different starting quarterback. Yeah, that's just no way to grow a team or an offense. And so you're going to bring in a new guy, and the options aren't very pleasant at all. I mean, they paled in comparison to what Carson Wentz offered last year. So now you're going to go into this with your coach and your GM reloading with at best a lateral move at quarterback, and an owner who saw this team melt down the last 2 weeks of the season. Will it be playoffs or bust next year? I don't think so. But boy, they've got to show some direction, I guess, or some semblance of, we know where we're going, we know what we're doing at the most important position. And as we sit here right now, I don't know what that direction is. They have to have some idea what they're doing. They're not sitting there and then come March 16th, they release him and now say, well, boy, now we got to hold a quarterback. You don't do it that way. But with this quarterback landscape, the draft, free agency, I see people on Twitter with Colt connections, fan connections, I mean, and they say, if we can get Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, it's just not realistic. But because, by the way, you've got their first round draft pick, and that's what normally fuels trades are draft picks. Players can work, Quentin Nelson. Okay, take Quentin Nelson, but teams want draft picks. They want those high draft picks. So it's just really an awkward dynamic to where they're going to move forward probably with a new quarterback, and there's going to be anticipation from the owner to get this thing fixed. And that's a hard way to get things fixed when you don't really have that quarterback in place.
Mike, something we had to deal with the last couple of years here in Philadelphia with Carson Wentz, and it was all about perception. We don't know that it's the case, but we're pretty sure about our perception. One of Carson's issues and problems was he was always looking over his shoulder. At first it was Nick Foles, steps in, wins the Super Bowl. Guys in the locker room seemed to like him better than Carson Wentz, and we believe that got Carson off the rails. Nick Foles gets moved. He gets free agents. All right, no more Foles problem. So they draft Jalen Hurts in the 2nd round, and that seems to bother Carson Wentz immeasurably, just as a backup. Was there anything like that in Indianapolis this year?
There was nobody to look over your shoulder to. Yeah. Sam Ehlinger was the backup, and they weren't going to play him barring injury. So no, I understand all of, and I heard all those dynamics in Philly, but that wasn't the case here. He was the guy. I mean, he was. They carted him out there in week 2 or week 3 at Tennessee after he had sprained his ankles, and he couldn't move. It made zero sense from a football standpoint to play, but he was the best option when he couldn't move. So no, there wasn't any another bad game, and he's out. So, and by all accounts, again, not being in the locker room and only getting players in the media room, you really don't get a feel on how they gravitate towards a player. But when players talked about him, it was glowingly, and you know, that's not a great way to judge anything because you're not getting any depth into it. But there was really never any hints or whispers of, boy, this guy, he's not connecting in the locker room. So I understand that in Philly, but that wasn't the case here because there was no threat to take his position.
Mike, I want to shift gears with you because you had some time with Nick Sirianni and Kevin Patullo and Jonathan Gannon pre-pandemic, so you got to know those guys a little bit. Did you get a thought of those guys and said they had a bright future in this league? Because, you know, a lot of criticism of Nick in his opening press conference when he got here originally, but by the end of last year, he's probably the best rookie head coach, at least in the rookie class. Did you see that with him at all in Indianapolis?
Primarily with Nick because he's the one we got to talk to each week, and he was really good to work with, and he always came across as having his head screwed on straight. He was kind of good to go back and forth with. There was a personality there. I was probably a little surprised he got a head coaching job that quickly, just because he didn't call plays here.
Yeah,
that was Frank's deal. But and again, excuse me, I watched that first opening press conference and I thought, boy, they're going to really skewer this guy, and he was.
yeah.
And here he is. He gets the team in the playoffs with what amounted to a new quarterback. So it was real. I was pleased for him, and I think the world of him. And I just think he's got the bright future again. And if he can build on what he did last year, you know, major kudos to him.
I've got another quarterback question for you. JAKIB Eason was a guy I really liked at Washington. Was at Georgia, decided to transfer out, but then again, Fields was at Georgia and decided to transfer out. But doesn't mean you can't move on from Georgia and have a nice NFL perspective career. He was the backup to start last year. They drafted Ehlinger, which meant they had questions and reservations even before the season started. They end up trading him in season to Seattle. I liked the guy. I thought he had a chance to be a starting NFL quarterback, not a franchise quarterback, but a guy who would earn himself a starting job in the league. Now he's buried on Seattle's bench, and I don't think he's taken over if they trade Russell Wilson. You got a chance to see the kid preseason, practices, hear what you hear. Why didn't JAKIB Eason improve in his couple years in the NFL?
It's funny. You had Ehlinger and you had Eason, and Ehlinger has it as a quarterback. Whatever it is, you know, some guys have and some guys don't. They just command leadership, and you know, players really gravitate towards him. And Ehlinger doesn't have near the physical tools as Eason. Eason had all the tools, and he was lacking it. He just didn't. And again, it's so hard to quantify what it is. But if you put him out there and just say, you know, go through a passing workout, let's see what you got, he'd wow you. You think, man, that guy, and he looks the part. Big, strong arm, which Ehlinger doesn't have. He's not the size. But we'd watch him in training camp, and boy, sometimes he'd make that throw, and you'd say, "But he's got it. He's got it. He's got what you need." And then when things kept going on, whether he just didn't process things quickly or whatever, and I don't go on the one brief time he had when he played against the Rams at the end when Wentz got hurt. That was unfair. It was a bad situation. But from what we saw in training camp, it just didn't work, and they stuck with it as long as they could. And then finally got rid of him. And like you said, he's in Seattle. And if Russell Wilson goes somewhere, I don't know that JAKIB Eason is the answer. Mm. So and again, I think he was a 4th-round pick. So it's not like they had a ton of you know, capital invested in him. But if a 4th-round pick can show you anything, you're going to keep him. And they didn't. And they stuck with Brett Hundley, who they got off his couch during training camp when all these injuries hit, and Sam Ehlinger and Carson Wentz, and that was their quarterback room.
Well, it's it's a tough situation to be in. So I want you to put on your Chris Ballard hat, Mike, because this team, the Indianapolis Colts, I mean, Jonathan Taylor, arguably the offensive player of the year in this league. Maybe if there wasn't Cooper Kupp, Quentin Nelson is, I don't know, he's the only guy I watch offensive line highlights for. He's so good. Darius Leonard, you mentioned, is one of the best 2 or 3 linebackers in this league. There's a lot of pieces in place for the Indianapolis Colts. Does that create a sense of urgency to go out of the box? And maybe did that create the whole problem with Carson Wentz? Because there are so many good players on that team. You feel a need to sort of go for it.
Yeah, and going back to last year, I still think Carson Wentz was the best option. When they weren't going to go after Matthew Stafford, it just wasn't going to. They weren't going to give up that much. But here we are. You're right. They had 7 Pro Bowlers, and you can make of that what you want, how we value the Pro Bowl. But that was, I think, the most in the league. They had a handful of All Pros. You mentioned DeForest Buckner, who's a quality defensive tackle. Yes, there is an urgency because every year you don't, maximize your young talent, they get older. And you don't want to be a Jacksonville where you see some good players come through there and you never get the quarterback situation solved. This has been an issue since Andrew Luck retired in 19, and it's been very difficult. And not difficult, they've not been able to move on from it yet. So, yes, there is urgency, but again, it's the imperfect storm of them desperately needing stability, and this offseason simply doesn't provide. Maybe they know something we don't, but I just don't see where the good option is that they're going to go to, and I'm convinced they're going to go to somebody. And it speaks volumes when the owner and part of the brain trust is basically saying we want anybody but Carson Wentz to be our quarterback, because right now you don't know who that's going to be.
Mike, we know that the Colts don't have their first-round draft pick this year. Well, that's right, here in Philadelphia. But they will be drafting ahead of the Eagles in all the following rounds because the Colts finished just outside the playoffs and the Eagles finished just inside the playoffs as both teams were 9 and 8. What are their biggest needs in the draft? Where do you think they're targeting position-wise? Are they going to be the kind of team that's going to stick it to the Eagles? Ooh, Eagles going to take a safety here. Oh, the 2 picks before the Eagles. The Colts take a safety off the board. What kind of needs do the Colts have going into this year's draft?
I hadn't thought about that. That'd be a nice storyline, wouldn't it? We'll get that deep throat from Philly and just kind of screw them with what they pick. What's kind of crazy is this is a good roster. It's almost like playoff ready. They demolished Buffalo last year. I mean, they had quality wins, beat New England. But the problem is that their issues are with the prime positions: quarterback, left tackle. They need help at edge pass rusher. I mean, they drafted the top 2 guys last year were edge, but you don't know really. So you need a tight end. Maybe Zach Ertz finally finds his way back to Frank Reich. I don't know. But again, they need a receiver. They need a top receiver. So they've got, as good as this roster is, and it is good, this just isn't team speak. The prime positions when you're building a team, those are the ones that are at issue right now. Again, quarterback, edge pass rusher, left tackle. They need a top cornerback probably, and a tight end, and a receiver. So a lot of work to do, and not having a first-round pick and having to probably invest more capital into a quarterback will limit somewhat what they can do. Now, they're going to have good cap space. They've got like $35 million, I think it is, and getting rid of Wentz will create another 13 or 14 million, I believe it is. So they've got avenues to do that. And I tell you, they've got an owner. I tell you, if they could make a trade work for Aaron Rodgers, Jim Irsay would pay $50 million a year and not bat an eye. But it's getting him to where you can do that. So it's not a reluctance from the owner to pay. It's going to be, how do you get that guy so the owner can pay him?
All right, Mike, last one from me, and I always like to say this for those who don't know, and follow Mike on at fox59.com in Indianapolis. Mike is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame Selection Committee. We've had a number of voters on the show. We had Ira Kaufman yesterday, Mike. We get Damo on all the time. D. Orlando Ledbetter, a lot of guys we've had the enjoyment to talk to about that process, and I love it. So I want to ask you about this year's class, and if you had any thoughts on anybody surprised that you got over the hump, anybody disappointed that you wanted to get over the hump and didn't get over the hump.
Well, I think the last one first. I had hoped to get Reggie Wayne over the hump. Former Colt, 10th in all time in receiving and yards. And I've presented him now for the last 3 years, so I must be doing a crappy job presenting him. But it's a tough room because, again, these 15 guys are all – it's funny, whenever there's discussion, everybody says, hey, he's a Hall of Famer. He's a Hall of Famer. Well, you only get 5. That's
Right.
the problem. I was a little surprised that Tony Baselli finally got in, and I've always thought that like if you're a first ballot guy, you almost need to just stand up and then say his name and sit down. He needs to be that firm.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit surprised, like DeMarcus Ware didn't get in. He's not that level of a guy, but I thought he might get in first time. Baselli finally got in. Sam Mills got in, linebacker. And a lot of the push was this was his last year. And
yeah, Ira said that yesterday.
If he doesn't get in, he goes in the senior pool, and that's the black hole for talent. So that did, and I don't mean to diminish Sam Mills' selection at all, but I think that played a major role in it. I had really hoped this was the year for Reggie. I'll keep banging that drum because all of a sudden now we're getting a line of receivers with Reggie and Torrey Holt and Andre Johnson. So. And coming up, we're going to have a lot of more tough decisions with these guys. You know, in 5 years, we're going to have Tom Brady and Ben Roethlisberger and maybe Adrian Peterson, perhaps. So it's really enjoyable to do. But everybody comes out of that room. There's 49 of us. Everybody comes out a little bit PO'd because you bring your own biases and your own opinions in, and you don't agree. You just that's why it takes like an 80% to get you in. We're going to have discussions, and I'm sure Damo and Ira would say the same thing. It's you just at the end of the day, you have to trust the process, and that would not have been my final 5, but that's what we came up with, and that's why the process works. Is that's the group that we agreed on.
All right, let me wrap up on this note, tying a couple things together: Hall of Fame and draft. Something we talked about, both things we've talked about so far. 2 years from now. Will there be a big push to land Marvin Harrison Jr. in Indianapolis to follow in the footsteps of his old man, the Hall of Famer Marvin Harrison Sr.?
I think the perfect. I tell you, I congratulated Marvin Sr. on his son, and he gave me a thumbs up. So it's good to see Marvin still around and kicking. I think the long range plan is to get Marvin Jr. and then a few years later to get Arch Manning.
Yeah.
we're just going to start up all over again because apparently Arch Manning is the best Manning of all of them. So that'd be a great way to kind of complete the circle here in Indy.
Manning to Harrison. That would, it'd take a lot of work off the play-by-play guy's plate. You have that already laid out later. Great stuff. We appreciate you coming on board. Thank you much. Again, we'll keep an eye on Carson Wentz. He's going to keep you busy, kept us busy here for years. We appreciate you hopping on board with us.
Thank you. You guys be well.
Thanks,
Our
Mike.
pleasure. Mike Chappell does his work these days at Fox 59. Colts beat guy forever in Indianapolis, Indianapolis Star. Previous to this, gave us some good insight, and we thank him for hopping aboard. All right, Johnny Mac, Mac and Mac guys, still got 10 minutes to play. We're coming back next here on Birds 365.